Hello folks, and welcome to your first lesson of Flip Week. This week we're going to be introducing the Romantics unit, which is your paper 3 section B question. And to get you started, you may have seen this picture before. This is Wanderer above a sea of fog. What I'd like you to do is to consider the image on this slide and think about what the concept of the painting is, how the figure is presented, and what is the mood of the painting. So our plan today is to look at the content and questions for paper 3 and get an idea about the types of style of question that we're going to be asked. We're then going to look at definitions for the term Romanticism, focusing particularly on the context around the movement. And there's going to be a few brief videos that I'd like you to take notes on that will support your contextual knowledge. Our question for today's session is: what concepts can you remember from your study of Frankenstein last year that are developed in today's context introduction? This also might be a good opportunity for you to dig out those prose notes from last year when you studied Frankenstein, and to have a look at some of the context and develop upon those context notes that you've already made. So paper 3 has 2 sections in it. It's your third and final exam, and the exam length is 2 hours and 15 minutes. Both sections, section A and section B, are equally weighted, but you spend just 1 hour on section B and 1 hour and 15 on section A, and that's because the section A side of the paper is comparing a poem of the decade to an unseen poem, and because you have that unseen element, that's why we encourage you to spend that additional 15 minutes. The section B then, so the Romantics question, as we've said, it's an hour that you should be spending roughly on this question. It's just on romantic poetry. You, like all the other questions in the Edexcel exam, will need to answer one question from a choice of 2, and you explore one named poem plus a poem of your choice. One thing that's quite unusual about this particular question is that you're not assessed on AO4, so you're not assessed on those connections and comparisons. Instead, the things that you're assessed on is AO1, AO2 and AO3. So this is what the questions will look like in the question paper. And the Romantics questions are always questions 11 and 12, so you'll need to flick through the booklet to the page that has these questions on it. And let's look at the question styles here. So they both start with explore the ways in which, and the first question, a sense of place is presented in Songs of Experience London by William Blake and one other poem. You must consider relevant contextual factors. So here we have the thematic focus, so a sense of place, or in the second question, solitude. We have our named poem, so we have Songs of Experience London. The second poem that's named on the slide, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, is no longer a poem that you study in the collection. They reduced the number a couple of years ago. One poem of your choice is mentioned in both poems, but as we've said, we don't, sorry, both the questions, but as we've said, we don't need to compare with this. And then we have a little reminder from the example that we must refer to contextual factors in our answer. So we've got to talk about the historical relevance, the political relevance. We might briefly touch on biographical evidence with these poems too. But ultimately, what I would like to encourage you to do is to talk about the wider Romantic movement. And AO1, AO2 and AO3 are all equally weighted for this. So let's move on to our second objective of today, looking at the definition of Romanticism. So the Oxford Companion to English Literature defines Romanticism as, in abstract terms, Romanticism may be regarded as the triumph of the value of imaginative spontaneity, visionary originality, wonder and emotional self-expression over the classical standards of order, restraint, proportion and objectivity. Its name derives from romance, the literary form in which desires and dreams prevail over everyday realities. So we've got some really key ideas that are being presented here. We have this idea that imaginative spontaneity, visionary originality, wonder and emotional self-expression is valued within the movement, and it becomes a preoccupation of the Romantic poets to be focusing on imaginative qualities and visionary qualities, looking towards the future. They're also concerned, as part of that, with radical social reform, as we're going to see shortly. So in Europe, during the Romantic era, this was a time of revolution. 1789, we have the French Revolution, which is really kicking things off. Greece are having a revolution as well, and it's these kind of moments of unrest in society are largely based around things like class issues. So what we see with the Romantics is that they in different ways kind of adopt the voice of the lower class, of the everyday working man, of the underdog in society. Finally, one thing that we absolutely must mention with the Romantics is their appreciation of nature and the natural world. And we'll see that as we kind of move through the rest of our presentation. So Romanticism is the name given to a dominant movement in literature and the other arts, particularly music and painting as well, in the period from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. And critics debate sort of when exactly the Romantic period sort of begins and ends. I think there's a consensus that focuses around the French Revolution as being a kind of beginning, so sort of the 1789 beginning the movement, and then it's sort of into the 1840s where the movement begins to kind of come to a bit of a close. It's regarded as having transformed artistic styles and practices. It's a retrospective term, so it's applied anachronistically or later by literary art and music historians. So none of the artists or poets in the Romantic era would have described themselves as romantics or romantic writers. It's also a European phenomenon, particularly powerful in Britain, France and Germany, but it also affects other countries such as Italy, Spain and Poland. There was also to some extent an American version of the movement that we're going to very briefly touch on in a moment. So continuing with our key features of the movement, we've mentioned already that there's an emphasis on emotional and imaginative spontaneity. So what this means is that the Romantic poets were preoccupied with the powers of the imagination and those kind of sudden feelings, sudden ideas that kind of pop into your head, pop into your body, and that these come from a kind of a very spiritual, deep connection with the world, and should be kind of acted on in some way. That feelings are more important than ideas about order and reason. It's definitely the heart comes before the head for the Romantics. As part of that, it's also important for the Romantics to explore self-expression and individual feeling. Romantic poetry is one of the heart and of emotions, as we've said, and is about exploring the truth of imagination rather than scientific truth. It's more of a subjective view of the world than an objective view of the world. We have the eye of the poem and the voice being absolutely central. It's the poet's perception and feelings that are the most important as a kind of everyday man, everyday observer looking out into the world. Their relationship with nature is can be described as almost religious. So they're concerned that nature should not just be seen scientifically, but as a living force, either made by a creator, particularly the early Romantics, or in some way having some kind of divine quality. Some of them were no longer Christian in their beliefs, so that's particularly into the second wave of the Romantics. Shelley was a very famous atheist, and while Wordsworth was a pantheist, so someone that believed in God but believed that God was in everything, every living thing, much of their poetry celebrates the beauty of nature, and regardless of their religious leanings, ultimately it's the beauty of nature and the rejection of growing industrialisation of the century that binds the Romantic poets together. As part of their emotional and imaginative spontaneity, there's also a celebration of the capacity for wonder and therefore also the reverence of the innocence of childhood. This is partly connected to a term that you would have come across in your first year of study of the sublime. So that idea of something being awesome, overpowering, wonderful, and beyond the limits of human understanding. And that feeling that of the sublime, of being overpowered by the beauty of the world, is likened by the Romantics to the innocence of a child, and the wonder that a child holds in everyday life. They are, as we've said on the previous slide, interested in the kind of outcasts, the underdogs of society. So tramps, beggars, the poor, the disregarded, are especially kind of evident in Romantic poetry. And also the Romantics will look at things like the victims of industrialisation. Their poetry, on the whole, is a political message that they're sending about the time. And finally, this kind of links into the idea that the poet is a visionary figure. They have they become poet prophets in both a political sense, that they are, striving forward into the future, making a comment on the society that they see around them, and saying, things could be better, we could be working towards a happier, more equal society. But also, again, particularly the early Romantics, they have a religious poet-prophet role, that they are able, through their poetry, to communicate to people the wonder of kind of religious experience and God. Now let's look at some of the historical context of the Romantic movement. So as we've said, Romanticism is thought to have started around 1789, the same year that the French Revolution started. And therefore it is thought to have a revolutionary mindset, which is at the heart of the Romantic movement. Romanticism was also a reaction to the very orderly rationalism of the Enlightenment period. The Romantics asserted the importance of individual feelings and warned against hard, objective reason, and rejected the idea of trying to find a scientific argument or reason for the workings of the world and the universe. Because if you find a scientific reason for everything in the world, it removes that sense of wonder and those kind of sublime emotional feelings, which are more true for the Romantics than the scientific reason itself. Wordsworth in particular decried the meddling intellect and looked for meaning in the human heart, arguing that science, with its tendency to dissect the natural world and its endless desire to define and categorise, was the negation of poetry. Nature meant various things to different Romantics at different times, whether the first and second wave. For the earlier Romantics, nature was kind of encompassing all divinity. So, as we've said, Wordsworth was a pantheist, and he saw God in everything. God was living in everything. Nature also, for the Romantics, has a healing power, a healing quality, and going out into nature, reconnecting with the land, was able to kind of soothe someone's spirit. Nature was also a source of subject as well as image. So the writing of poetry, creation of art, creation of music would hold nature as a kind of muse, as a subject there. And that was enough. Whereas before the Romantic movement, you would have to have a subject within the painting that, or within a poem that was a muse. So it could be like a person, it could be a building. A lot of the kind of paintings leading up to the Romantic movement had a lot of kind of industrial buildings within, which is something that I think we find a little bit kind of odd looking back on today, when we're so used to, we still see the ripples of the Romantic movement in the art that is produced today. Nature was also seen as a refuge from civilization. So we might use the kind of colloquial idiom, recharging my batteries. I'm going to go into nature and recharge my batteries. It's about going back into nature to soothe yourself after having a busy time working in the cities, for example, and being more concerned with otherworldly matters, and tapping into the very kind of personal, individual emotions, rather than being concerned with the interpersonal relationships and the kind of everyday matters that the Romantics saw as kind of weighing on a person and kind of binding them up. Nature is also seen as kind of organic rather than artificial. So one thing that we see in gardens around the time, as an example, is people would let their gardens kind of grow over more, and the Romantics kind of celebrated the idea that, you know, nature is kind of living and healing, and it doesn't need to be ordered and controlled and cut back like the Enlightenment style kind of gardens. It should be kind of left free to grow and expand, or, you know, die and rot, but it does it in its own right rather than having to be controlled by man. And it's these wild, uncultivated aspects of nature which were seen as a kind of rebellion, really, against this ordered and disciplined facets of society. So continuing on with the Romantics' relationship with nature, we absolutely must look at Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, first published in England in 1757. What Burke focuses on here in the sublime is smallness, so being made to feel small by the universe, a sense of kind of orderliness and structure within within our lives, and finally the kind of the brightness of the experiences that we can kind of glean from being made to feel small in amongst such a big unknowable universe. To the Romantics, the sublime had associations with darkness as well, with solitude, infinity, and a terror which is inspired by the ideas of the gigantic and the incomprehensible, as I've talked about before. So we also have a development upon the idea of the sublime from Burkean, the Burkean sublime, by German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he held the sublime as this kind of noble, splendid, terrifying part of the world and experience that we can feel. And he goes beyond the Burkean idea that nature can be simply beautiful, but instead he develops the idea that nature is great and boundless and unknowable by man.
Normally, we hate being made to feel small. We can't stand being humbled or reminded of our insignificance. We get affronted and resentful. The 18th century Anglo-Irish philosopher Edmund Burke, however, thought that these experiences could be rather wonderful and quite important too. To explain what he meant, he developed the idea of the sublime in a beautiful book called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, first published in England in 1757. In modern use, sublime just means very, very nice, a sublime glass of Chambertin, a sublime plate of scrambled eggs with truffles. But this wasn't at all what Burke was interested in, though there is a slight connection. For Burke, a sublime experience is indeed one that's really nice, but it's nice for a very strange reason. It makes us feel insignificant. Burke was obsessed with a range of experiences, that is, sublime experiences, in which being slightly humiliated is actually something we relish. He was picking up on a sector of human experience that up to then had been totally ignored. One of his key examples is storms. The vast dark sky is oppressive, the wind is horribly powerful, large trees are overturned. We feel we're nothing in the face of the violence of nature. But this helps put things in perspective. In comparison with a storm, the familiar irritants of daily life seem less significant. Something similar happens when we contemplate a huge mountain or view the enormous frozen wilderness of the Labrador coast from the window of an Airbus A380. Burke also liked vast, momentous stories. He loved Milton's Paradise Lost, which describes the cosmic struggle between God and Satan, because stories like these also make the irksome details of ordinary life seem for a moment almost idiotically minor. Burke is latching on to a good way of being made to feel small. He's noticing that when we feel small in some ways, we become good and large in other dimensions. Bits of our egoism and pride seem less impressive. So we might be moved to be more tolerant, less wrapped up in our own concerns. Burke saw the sublime as a useful corrective. It restores perspective, and that's why we like it. It's a psychological maneuver that can benefit us in many ways and shows its utility whenever there's an excessive tendency to get caught up in the details of an immediate situation. Thanks to Edmund Burke, a little but valuable area of experience gained a name. It became possible to focus on it and see its role in life more clearly. The sublime emerged at first in connection with nature and the arts, but its contribution to existence is actually quite broad. We don't just need the sublime on holiday or in an art gallery, which are unfortunately the places we're liable to encounter it. It's something we need to build into our lives on a daily basis. In the utopia, there would be deliberate strategies to ensure we encounter the sublime on a regular basis. In the past, religions were quite careful to set up a meeting with the sublime every Sunday. After a week in the factory or the office, or caught up in domestic life, everyone would be confronted with ideas of eternal grandeur, a God who loves the world so much that he sacrificed his only son for our salvation, architecture that asserted a heritage of 1,000 years, and music calculated to make us feel part of the whole of humanity. But for almost everyone, that resource is no longer available. We're collectively in need of new occasions to meet the sublime in a reliable, frequent way, so that we can be made to feel small in the most helpful way on a regular basis.
So here's a little extract from Burke's text. I know of nothing sublime which is not some modification of power, and this rises from terror. Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, whatever is in any sort terrible, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. I say the strongest emotion because I am satisfied that the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. So what is Burke saying here? He's defining this power of nature, and he says that the power of nature that is able to excite these kind of ideas of fear, of danger, of feeling insignificant, and these kind of strong emotions are important for us because they demonstrate what the mind is capable of feeling, and they're able to kind of contradictory that they are able to make us feel a sense of relief in the idea that our everyday lives, when we're not encountering the sublime, are not as terrifying, as kind of painful, as terrible, as kind of scary. So we need to look at how Immanuel Kant modifies the Burkean idea of the sublime in his Critique of Judgment 1790. So I'm going to read through this slide, and what I'd like you to do is to summarise this definition in sort of 1 or 2 sentences in your notes, ready for when we come back in January and start kind of hitting the ground running with looking at the sublime and nature in poetry. So Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Judgment 1790, further clarifies Burke's definition of the sublime, mostly in contrast to the beautiful. He says that the beautiful in nature is not quantifiable, but rather focused only on colour, form, surface, etc. of an object. Therefore, the beautiful is to be regarded as the presentation of an indeterminate concept of understanding. However, to Kant, the sublime is more infinite and can be found even in an object that has no form at all. The sublime should be regarded as a presentation of an indeterminate concept of reason. Basically, what Kant's arguing here is that the beauty is a temporary response of understanding, and that the sublime goes beyond the aesthetic into the realm of reason. Whereas Burke argues that the sublime arises from an object that incites terror, Kant says that the object can be terrifying and thus sublime without the beholder actually ever being afraid of it. But there is much more to Kant's definition of the sublime. He claims that the sublime in itself is so great that anything compared to it must necessarily be considered small. And because of that, an important aspect of the sublime is the work of one's imagination, to comprehend something so great that it seems inconceivable. Thus, one major aspect of the sublime is the power of mankind's mind to recognise it. Kant transforms the sublime from a terrifying object of nature to something intricately connected to the rational mind and hence to mortality. So on this slide and the next slide, what we would like you to do is to create a timeline for the Romantics. So you could start by watching this video and making some notes about the significance of 6 named events during the Romantic movement here. You can use the handout that's provided in the resources for today, but it isn't necessary that you do. You might also want to add additional information to the timeline on the second side of the handout, or just create a kind of large timeline list, so you've got plenty of room to add extra notes in.
Romanticism is one of the most important historical events of all time. Unlike a lot of what gets called history, Romanticism isn't a war or a piece of technology or a political event. It refers to the birth of a new set of ideas. It's about a mindset and a way of feeling. Romanticism began in Western Europe in the mid-18th century in the work of artists, poets and philosophers, and it subsequently spread all over the world, changing how millions of people look at nature, children, love, sex, money and work. We are all now, more or less, in some aspects of our sensibilities, romantics. Romanticism is best understood as a reaction to the birth of the modern world and some of its key features: industrialization, urbanization, secularization, and consumerism. What follows are some of the central moments in the history of Romanticism. The Marais, Paris, May 1762. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau publishes a book about the raising of children, Émile, or On Education. It contains diatribes against the oppressive world of adults and praises the natural goodness, spontaneity and wisdom of little children. It is at points extremely anxious to get mothers to breastfeed their offspring, the first sustained argument for this practice in Western civilization. The world around Rousseau is growing ever more rational, scientific and technologically based. It's increasingly sensible, planned, sterile and bureaucratic. Against all of this, Rousseau emphasizes the child, the original rebel, the representative of everything that's pure, unschooled and outside of adult discipline. It's the seat of creativity and genius. For the first time in Western history, glamour is directed not at the attainment of reason and adult self-control, but at the freedom from tradition and the natural innocence and sweetness of the child. Brook Street, London, August 1770. A precocious 17-year-old poet called Thomas Chatterton downs some arsenic and ends his life in a tiny attic apartment. He kills himself because no one wants to publish his poetry, which is concerned with beauty and wisdom, and because his uncomprehending family are applying pressure for him to become a lawyer. A cult soon grows up around the young, beautiful poet with shoulder-length chestnut hair. He becomes an emblem of something that will become very important for romantics: the idea of the sensitive, doomed person, often an artist, rejected by a cruel, vulgar world. Chatterton stands at the head of a long line of romantic heroes that will stretch from Byron to Keats to Van Gogh and eventually all the way to Jim Morrison and Amy Winehouse. Romanticism borrows from Christianity. The romantic hero is a secularized, Christ-like figure, the loser who is in truth deeply noble in the eyes of the few who understand. Leipzig, Germany, 1774. The German author Goethe publishes the quintessential romantic love story, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It tells the story of a passionate, doomed love affair between a young poet called Werther and a beautiful, clever young woman called Charlotte. Unfortunately for Werther, Charlotte is married, so the love is impossible from the very start. But that doesn't stop Werther, a dreamy and practical young man who loves the arts above all else. Like Chatterton, Werther is under pressure to have a sensible career and join bourgeois life, but he can think of only one thing: the impulses of his heart. Eventually, Werther can't take it anymore and kills himself. But rather than condemning him as a lunatic and a hothead, Goethe, one of the founding fathers of Romanticism, directs all our sympathies towards Werther. We're supposed to be on his side, admiring his passionate and entirely impractical attitude to love. The book becomes the most popular novel of a generation. 3 million copies are printed. Napoleon declares it the greatest work of European literature, and it dramatically changes how many people think of love, privileging dramatic outpourings of feeling over more traditional, rational concerns for class, lineage, and money. For a romantic, it's always right and noble to follow your heart. The disastrous results that follow aren't any argument. They're just proof of how desiccated and heartless the so-called adult, sensible world can be. Madrid, Spain, 1798. The artist Francisco Goya produces one of his most iconic images, titled "The Sleep of Reason Brings Out Monsters." It captures a quintessential romantic interest in the limits of reason and the power of the irrational over humans' fragile minds. To be romantic is to have sympathy for madness and to hold an almost vengeful attitude towards bombastic claims as to the triumph of rationality, science, and logic. The Lake District, England, December 1799. A young English poet called William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy move into what's set to become one of the most famous residences in the history of English literature, Dove Cottage in Grasmere on the edge of the Lake District. Here they will spend the next 9 years, and Wordsworth will write some of the greatest poetry in the English language, celebrating something that's very under threat, the natural world. He'll write about daffodils, oak trees, clouds, butterflies and rivers, and his work will charm and seduce Europe. Within a generation there will, in Wordsworth's own estimation, be more tourists than sheep in the Lake District. Most importantly, running through Wordsworth's poetry is an abiding hatred for everything mechanical and industrial. When many years later a railway line threatens to pass through the Lake District, Wordsworth and his followers do everything they can to have the train, a symbol of Wordsworth's hated technology, rerouted. To be a romantic is to take the side of nature against industry. It's to prefer a daffodil to a viaduct, a tree to a factory. At the moment when huge swathes of Britain are being covered in the often monstrous new cities that are making Europe rich, Wordsworth, the quintessential romantic, speaks up for the natural and the simple life. Niagara, United States, September 1829. The American painter Thomas Cole paints one of his most characteristic images of the mighty Niagara Falls with a couple of Native Americans in the foreground. Cole makes his name as a painter of sublime scenes, vast landscapes of the American interior, showing nature at its most dignified and impressive. Man looks lost and puny by comparison. This too is a typical romantic attitude, for romantics don't believe in God, but they go in search of the emotions one might once have had around religion, and locate them in the big, wide-open spaces of nature. To be a romantic is to find relief from the pressures of competitive city life in the sort of natural grandeur that transcends all human achievements and concerns. Westminster, London, April 1847. 14 years after some fairly incompetent officials destroy the British Parliament with fire, a new building reopens designed by a rising star architect, Augustus Pugin. Oddly, even though the building is new, it's made to look old, very, very old, medieval in fact. It's full of suits of armour and seated angels. When the architect Pugin defends the building, he argues that his building is noble because it harks back to his country's pre-industrial past, before it grew obsessed, he's careful to add, with money or technology. It begins a cult of the Middle Ages, a big theme in Romanticism, which identifies in the world of knights and castles a nobility that is thought missing from the factories and shopping arcades of the modern world. Saint-Germain, Paris, May 1863. The French poet Charles Baudelaire writes a prose poem celebrating an unusual character whom he calls a flâneur, a stroller or loafer. A casual wanderer who has no particular job to go to and just spends his time observing busy street life of a modern city, threading his way through the crowds, strolling instead of rushing, sampling people's conversations and creating narratives for others' lives. Baudelaire, a typical romantic, admires the flaneur's playfulness and lack of practicality. This person isn't a waste of time. It doesn't matter that he doesn't have a job. For Baudelaire, he is a prince, unlike the boring wage slaves rushing to the new offices of capitalism. Le Havre, April 1891. The French painter Paul Gauguin sets sail for Tahiti, hoping to escape everything that is artificial and conventional. He lives in the Pacific South Seas on and off for the rest of his life, drawing young native women looking relaxed and natural without anything on. They are, in his eyes, evidence that civilization is what has made us sick, a core romantic belief. The Romantic movement has permanently changed our sensibilities. As the world has grown ever more technological and rational, Romanticism has come to stick up for the irrational, the untrained, the exotic, the childlike and the naive. There is naturally something a bit adolescent and immature within Romanticism, but then again there can be something rather heartless, cold, dogmatic and arrogant in many aspects of modernity. One hopes this isn't going to be the end of the story, that we may in the future learn to soften the worst sides of modernity through the best sides of Romanticism, in order to create a more evolved alternative, what one might term an age of maturity.
So now let's look at the Romantic poets and where they sit within the movement. So all of the poets listed in English Romantic verse can be considered to be part of the Romantic movement. Some of the earlier poets in the anthology, such as William Blake or Robert Burns, would be described as pre-Romantics. And then we have our first generation of Romantics, also called the Lake poets because of their attachment to the Lake District, who are William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Southey, Charles Lamb and Thomas de Quincey. And in our collection we study Blake, Wordsworth, and we don't study Coleridge anymore. The second generation of Romantics include Lord Byron, Percy Shelley and John Keats.